The wind had teeth that morning, biting through the empty land like a starving wolf. The prairie stretched endless, brown and broken, with only the whisper of dry grass to answer the wind's cry. A lone rider came slow along the trail, his horse weary and ribs showing under a faded saddle blanket. The man's coat was worn thin at the elbows, and dust from weeks of travel had turned his hat the same color as the dirt. His canteen was nearly dry, and the last strip of jerky hung forgotten in his saddlebag. He hadn't eaten since dawn yesterday, but there was a kind of steady calm in his hunger. He'd known worse days. He rode until the sun hung low behind the mountains, painting the sky in copper and blood. Just when he thought the land had gone entirely empty, he spotted a flicker of smoke rising behind a half-fallen barn near a frozen creek. His first thought was to keep riding. Out here, strangers were more dangerous than the cold. But something about that thin trail of smoke, uncertain and fragile, made him pull the reins. When he reached the barn, he found the fire built inside a hollow of old stones, small and flickering like it had no reason left to live. Near it sat a woman wrapped in a torn blanket, her hair tangled and her face drawn thin from hunger. She looked up when the horse stopped, eyes sharp despite the shadows beneath them. The man swung down, keeping his voice even. "You got trouble here?" he asked. Her voice came slow, rough from thirst. Only the kind that don't leave. He could see it plain. She hadn't eaten in days. There was no pot, no pan, only ashes and a single crust of bread so hard it looked like stone. Behind her, a small shape lay still beneath a wool coat. Maybe a child once. Maybe someone she couldn't bring herself to bury yet. The man didn't ask. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his last bit of food, a small piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. He broke it and handed her half. She looked at it but didn't take it. Her jaw set tight, pride fighting with hunger. "I don't need your pity," she said, voice trembling but defiant. The man studied her face, the way her lips trembled though her eyes stayed cold. "Ain't pity," he said quietly. "Just food." Her gaze softened for a breath, then hardened again. "You think I'm some beggar waiting for a man to save me?" "I think you're still alive," he said. "And I figure staying that way's worth swallowing pride for a minute." The words hung between them, caught in the crackle of the dying fire. She took the bread at last, slow and hesitant, and broke it in half again, offering part of it back to him. He shook his head, but she pressed it toward him anyway. "You'll need it more than me," she said. "You still got miles left to ride." He smiled faintly. "Then I'll take it as a trade, not charity." Her eyes softened just enough for the faintest ghost of a smile. "Trade for what?" He shrugged. "A bit of warmth by your fire." That made her laugh, a sound brittle but real. She motioned him closer and he sat across from her, holding his hands to the weak flame. The silence that followed wasn't unfriendly. It was the silence of two people too tired to talk, too proud to admit they needed company. After a while, he asked, "Been out here long?" "Too long," she said. "Since autumn, maybe longer. My folks homesteaded this land. Thought we could make something of it." Her voice broke for a moment, then steadied. Winter didn't agree. He looked toward the barn. "That your place?" "Was," she said. "The roof fell in after the first snow. The cattle died. The rest followed." She didn't say who the rest meant, but the man didn't press. He could feel the grief in her words, like a ghost that still lingered in the wind. She turned her eyes to the fire. "Why are you out here, stranger?" "No one rides this trail unless they've lost something." He hesitated. "Maybe I have." "Maybe?" she repeated. He poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the cold air. "I was a ranch hand south of the Rio. Boss sold the land, left us all without pay. I went looking for work, found nothing but empty towns and burned fences. Guess I just kept riding." The woman nodded as if she understood better than he'd said. Empty land's got a way of keeping men wandering. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the sound of something distant. Wolves, maybe, or the groan of an old tree breaking under ice. The horse shifted restlessly, sensing the same unease. The cowboy reached for his rifle, laying it across his knees without a word. The woman noticed but didn't ask. In the frontier, people learned not to ask certain things. When the wind died, she whispered, "You shouldn't stay long. There's folks who come through here at night looking for scraps or worse." He met her eyes. "You mean men?" She nodded. "3 of them. Used to be trappers. Now they take what they want. They found me once before." His jaw tightened. "They come back often?" "They said they would. When the snow melts." The man looked toward the mountains, their peaks hidden in cloud. "Snow's melting already." Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled the blanket closer. "Then I reckon time's up. He studied her for a long moment. She wasn't just starving for food, she was starving for hope. The kind that comes when someone decides not to give up on you. He didn't know why, but something in him couldn't leave her there to face it alone. He stood and walked to his horse, checking the saddle strap. "You got any weapons?" "Just an axe head," she said quietly. "Handle broke last winter. Then I'll fix that tomorrow. And I'll stay tonight." She shook her head. "You shouldn't. They'll kill you too." He smiled slightly. "They'll have to try." The woman looked away, her jaw trembling as if fighting back the tears she'd buried too deep to cry anymore. "You don't even know me." "I don't have to," he said. "I know the kind of people worth saving." The fire crackled between them, painting both their faces in the same weary gold. Outside, the sound of distant footsteps, or maybe hooves, echoed faintly through the dark. The woman's eyes darted to the open doorway. "Did you hear that?" The man moved silently, rifle in hand, and stepped to the barn's edge. The night beyond was quiet but heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The moonlight fell pale across the frozen creek, glinting on something that looked like metal, too still to be water, too bright to be stone. He turned slightly toward her. "Someone's out there." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then it's them!" The cowboy's hand tightened on the rifle. The woman's heart pounded so loud she swore the wind could hear it. Somewhere in the darkness, a twig snapped. The horse stamped nervously and the fire wavered, throwing shadows that looked too much like figures moving among the trees. He took one quiet step forward, then another, until the world narrowed to the sound of his boots and the thud of his heart. Behind him, the woman rose slowly, gripping the broken axe head like a desperate prayer. Her breath fogged the air in front of her as the wind shifted and carried a low voice across the cold. "Looks like we found company," the voice said. The cowboy froze, eyes narrowing. He could see them now, three shapes stepping from the dark, rifles glinting in the moonlight, grins hard and cruel. The woman's pulse stopped. Her fingers trembled around the weapon. The cowboy's voice came calm and steady, though his hunger had long turned to fire. "You boys picked the wrong night," the tallest of the men laughed. "Don't matter what night it is. She's ours." The woman took a small step back, her breath breaking. The cowboy didn't move. His rifle was raised now, steady as the cold sky. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. No wind, no flame, no mercy. Then, somewhere deep in that silence, the trigger clicked. The gun didn't fire, just the empty click like a cruel joke from fate. The cowboy didn't flinch, only shifted his grip and chambered another round. The men laughed, their boots crunching on the frozen ground as they moved closer to the barn. The tallest one had a scar running down his jaw and a coat made from wolf hide. His eyes glowed cold in the moonlight, hungry for something that wasn't food. The woman's breath caught as she stepped closer to the firelight, clutching her broken axe head like she meant to use it. The cowboy gave her a look, just one glance, but it said everything. "Stay back." The first man raised his rifle, but before he could aim, the cowboy's gun roared to life. The shot echoed through the night, scattering a flock of crows from the bare trees. The man stumbled back, dropping to his knees and cursing, clutching his arm. The others dove for cover, shouting threats. The woman gasped and ducked behind the fire pit, the flames throwing wild shadows across her face. Smoke filled the barn. The horse reared, eyes white with fear. The cowboy fired again, forcing the remaining men to fall back into the dark. Then everything went still. Only the wind moved, whistling through the broken boards. The cowboy waited, eyes scanning the edge of the woods. He knew they hadn't gone far. Men like that never left without what they came for. "You all right?" he asked without turning. The woman nodded, though her hands still trembled. "They'll come back." "I know," he said quietly, "but they won't find us sleeping." When he turned, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, something deeper than hunger, a weariness carved by too many nights like this one. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble, but trouble seemed to find him anyway. They spent the rest of the night keeping watch. The fire burned low, and the air inside the barn grew heavy with smoke and silence. The woman finally spoke, her voice softer now. "You didn't have to do that." He looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Do what?" "Risk your life for someone you just met." He gave a small shrug. "Didn't feel like I had much of a choice." She stared at the faint light on his face. "You could have kept riding. Most men would have. Maybe I ain't most men." The words lingered between them, quiet but full. Outside, the night began to fade, and the first hint of dawn touched the mountains. The woman turned toward it, her eyes glistening with the kind of hope she didn't want to admit. When the sun finally rose, The man stepped outside to check for tracks. He found them clear as writing in the snow, 3 sets leading away toward the river, one dragging slightly. He followed them a few yards, then stopped. The air smelled of gunpowder and pine. The trail ended near the creek, where the ice had been broken. He crouched, studying the footprints that disappeared beneath it. 1 man down, 2 left. When he came back, the woman was packing what little she had: a blanket, a cracked lantern, and a small wooden box tied with rope. "You leaving?" he asked. She paused. "I don't have a choice. They'll return, and if they find me here again, it won't end the same." He nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" "I've got a sister out west near the ridges past Black Hollow. If I can make it before the next storm." He looked at the sky. Dark clouds were already building to the north. "That storm's closer than you think. Then I'll have to move fast." He walked to his horse, untied a small bundle from the saddle, and handed her a piece of jerky. "You'll need this more than I will," she frowned. "I told you I don't take pity." "It ain't pity," he said. "It's a fair trade." "For company." She hesitated, then took it, folding the meat into her hand. Her voice softened. "You're stubborn. Been called worse." They packed in silence for a while. The barn creaked as the wind picked up, scattering ash from the fire. When they finally stepped out into the morning, the land looked endless again, cold, pale, and merciless. But something had changed between them. Neither said it, but they both felt it. The kind of quiet bond forged by shared danger. They walked side by side down the trail, the cowboy leading the horse. For a long time, neither spoke. The woman's steps were slow, her breath uneven from hunger and fatigue. "You ever been to Black Hollow?" she asked at last. He shook his head. "Heard stories. Some say it's cursed." Her lips tightened. "Everything west of the ridge is cursed if you listen to the right people." He gave her a sidelong glance. "You one of those people?" "I used to be," she said. "Then life taught me curses are just the names we give to places that break us." He nodded quietly. That made sense to him. He'd seen men curse the land, the war, the sky, anything that took what they loved. But the land didn't curse anyone. It just tested them. As they moved farther from the barn, the woman began to tell him pieces of her story. Her family had come from the east 3 winters ago, chasing a dream of owning land. Her father died the first season when the fever swept through. Her mother followed the next winter, and her husband, she hesitated when she said the word, disappeared into the hills after the cattle were lost. "Never came back," she said. "I think he couldn't stand watching it all fall apart." The cowboy didn't ask if she still hoped he was alive. Hope was a fragile thing in the frontier. It could save you or kill you, depending on how tight you held it. "What about you?" she asked after a while. "What's your story?" He didn't answer right away. "There's not much to tell," he said finally. "Worked ranches since I was 15. Rode with a few outfits, fought in one war, buried some good men, and kept riding when there wasn't anything left to stay for." "Sounds lonely," she said softly. He nodded once. "Most things worth doing are." They stopped at the creek to water the horse. The woman knelt to fill her hands with melting snow, sipping carefully. Her reflection wavered in the shallow water, hollow cheeks, tired eyes, a face that still carried traces of the woman she'd once been. She looked at him and said quietly, "You shouldn't keep helping me. You'll regret it." He met her eyes. "Maybe, but I've regretted worse things." Before she could answer, a distant echo reached them. Hooves. The sound carried across the valley, faint but growing. The cowboy turned sharply, scanning the horizon. "They found us," he said. The woman's face went pale. "How?" "Tracks in the snow," he muttered. "I should have covered them better." They hurried across the creek, moving toward a cluster of rocks that rose from the plain like jagged teeth. The cowboy led the horse behind them and motioned for her to crouch low. They waited, the cold biting through their clothes. The sound of hooves drew nearer, then stopped. From behind the rocks, they could see movement. A single rider this time, wearing a long coat and carrying a rifle slung across his back. He dismounted, scanning the ground. The cowboy recognized him, the scarred man's partner, the one who hadn't been hit. The woman gripped his arm. "If he finds us..." He shook his head. "He won't." The rider knelt near the creek, studying the tracks. Then he stood and whistled sharply. Another man appeared from the trees, so there were still 2. "They're splitting up," the cowboy whispered. "They'll circle around. What do we do?" He looked at the rising ridge to the west. "We run!" They moved fast, following a narrow deer path that wound between the rocks. The snow was thinner here, and the sun had begun to burn through the clouds, turning the world into blinding silver. Every few steps, the cowboy glanced back. The riders were still far, but closing in. The woman stumbled, nearly falling. He caught her arm, steadying her. "You all right?" "I can make it," she said through gritted teeth. They climbed until their lungs burned. When they reached the top, the cowboy turned and raised his rifle. The riders were closer now, their figures small but clear. He fired once, the bullet striking the ground near their horses. The echo rolled across the valley like thunder. The riders stopped. One raised his hand, shouting something the wind carried away. "They're warning us," she said. "Good," he replied. "Means they're scared." The woman looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not just a cowboy, but a man who'd spent too long surviving alone. Someone who'd learned to fight for things that mattered, whether it was land, pride, or a stranger too stubborn to die. "We can't keep running forever," she whispered. "I know," he said, loading another round. "But we can make it hard for them to follow." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke. The woman turned sharply. "The barn," he nodded grimly. "They burned it." She closed her eyes, the weight of loss pressing down again. Everything she'd ever known was ash now. Home, memories, all of it gone. The cowboy watched her silently, then said, "We'll build another fire somewhere else." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. "You really believe that?" He looked toward the horizon, where the sun broke through the clouds and lit the mountains in gold. "Out here, belief's all we've got." Behind them, the echo of hooves grew louder once more, carried by the wind like a promise of reckoning. And as they moved toward the far ridge, both knew that whatever waited on the other side would decide whether they lived, or just became another story swallowed by the land. The day wore on, and the ridge grew steeper as they climbed. The cowboy's horse struggled for footing on the loose stones, and the woman's breath came in short, cold bursts. Below them, the valley stretched endless and empty, but both knew it was not safe. Somewhere down there, the two riders still followed, patient and cruel. The cowboy had seen men like that before. They didn't give up because the hunt was the only thing left that made them feel alive. By noon, they reached a ledge overlooking a small ravine where a stream ran thin under sheets of ice. The cowboy motioned for her to rest. She sank to the ground, clutching her blanket around her shoulders. Her lips were pale, and her hands trembled as she tried to light a small fire. The matches were damp, but he shielded them with his body until the flame caught. The smell of smoke rose soft and bitter. He looked at her quietly. She had strength in her, but it was the kind that came from loss, not comfort. He'd seen that same look in war camps, people too tired to hope but too proud to quit. "You should eat," he said, handing her what was left of the jerky. She shook her head. "You haven't eaten either." He didn't argue. He just set it beside her boot and looked toward the trees. "We can't stay long. They'll track us before nightfall." "Do you really think they'll keep chasing us?" she asked, her voice brittle. "They burned your place," he said flatly. "That wasn't about stealing. That was about power. Men like that don't stop until they finish what they started." Her eyes dropped to the fire. "Then we run until they can't." He nodded, but didn't tell her what he knew. Out here there was no running far enough. The land swallowed people whole, and unless they had a plan, it would swallow them too. As the fire died down, the woman untied her wooden box and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded letter, edges frayed from being read too many times. She held it for a moment before handing it to him. "My sister wrote it last spring," she said. "She said there was work near Black Hollow, families rebuilding after the flood. Said she'd save me a place if I could get there." He unfolded it gently, scanning the neat, faded handwriting. It spoke of crops, church bells, and a valley where the earth had healed from the storms. There was even talk of a small school being built by travelers who'd stayed. He folded it back and handed it to her. "That's hope," he said quietly. "It's just paper now," she replied. "But it's all I have left." He watched her tie the box again, careful like it was made of gold. There was something about her, the way she carried her sorrow with dignity, the way her eyes still searched for light even after everything had burned. When they set out again, the air grew heavy. Snow started falling, slow and soundless. Each flake melted against their skin, then froze again in the wind. They followed the ravine until the light began to fade, and that's when they saw it, a cabin tucked beneath a line of pines. The roof sagged, but smoke drifted faintly from its chimney. The cowboy raised his rifle slightly. Could be travelers, he said. Or worse, she whispered. He motioned for her to stay back, then approached the door. A dog barked once inside, followed by a man's voice. Who's there? The cowboy lowered his weapon a little. Just passing through. We're cold and need rest. After a long pause, the door opened. A man stood there with gray hair and kind eyes holding a lantern. Cold don't ask permission, he said. Come in. Inside, the cabin was small but warm. A woman stirred stew on the stove while 2 children sat by the hearth, watching silently. The stranger introduced himself as Silas, a trapper who'd lived there since the war ended. Storm's coming hard, Silas said. You'll be safer here till it passes. The cowboy nodded, grateful. The woman hesitated before stepping inside, her body tense as if kindness might turn into danger at any second. Over dinner, the smell of stew filled the room, and for the first time in days, warmth spread through their bones. The woman ate slowly, as though she feared it would be her last meal. Silas's wife, a quiet woman named May, noticed the way her hands shook and gently poured her more broth. You look like you've seen ghosts, May said softly. The woman met her gaze. Maybe I have. The cowboy caught the faint tremor in her voice. He knew she wasn't just talking about the men chasing them. When the children were asleep, Silas leaned back in his chair. You folks in some kind of trouble? The cowboy hesitated. You could say that. Those 2 riders that came through here yesterday? Silas asked. One had a scar down his jaw, the other missing a tooth. The cowboy's hand tightened around his cup. That's them. They asked about a woman and a drifter heading west, Silas said. Didn't like their tone, so I sent them north. But men like that don't scare easy. The woman's eyes filled with dread. They'll come back, Silas nodded slowly. Then you best be gone before dawn. That night, as the wind howled outside, the cowboy couldn't sleep. He sat near the dying fire, turning his hat in his hands. The woman stirred beside the hearth, wrapped in a quilt. She opened her eyes. You're thinking about them, she said. I'm thinking about what happens if we keep running, he replied. Sooner or later, they'll catch up. Then we fight, she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. They took everything from me once, she said. They don't get to take the rest. The cowboy nodded slowly. You sure you're ready for that? I stopped being afraid the day I buried my family, she whispered. The firelight flickered between them, and in that glow something unspoken passed, a promise, or maybe just understanding. When morning came, they packed quickly. Silas handed them a small bag of supplies, dried meat, matches, and a flask of coffee. There's an old mining camp west of here, he said. Abandoned, but the tunnels might hide you if they get too close. The cowboy tipped his hat in thanks, and they rode out into the gray dawn. By midday, the storm hit. Snow fell thick and heavy, turning the world white. They could barely see the trail, and the horse stumbled more than once. The woman clung to the saddle, shivering. Her lips were blue, but she didn't complain. We're close, he said, pointing toward the ridge where dark openings marked the entrance to the mine. Inside, it was cold and damp, but the wind couldn't reach them. The cowboy tied the horse and built a small fire from scraps of wood. The woman sat near it, rubbing her hands. Do you ever wonder, she asked softly, what life would have been if you'd stayed put somewhere? He smiled faintly. I tried once. Bought a piece of land near Abilene. Thought I'd plant corn, raise cattle. But drought came, then taxes, then the men with guns who said it wasn't mine anymore. So you left. He nodded. Been leaving ever since. She looked at him for a long time, as if seeing the man beneath the dust and scars. Maybe this time you stay. Before he could answer, a sound echoed from outside. A distant neigh, the crack of twigs and voices carried by the wind. The cowboy's hand went straight to his rifle. They found us, he said. The woman's pulse quickened. How? Same way I would have, he muttered. Follow the tracks, watch the smoke. He doused the fire and motioned for her to move deeper into the mine. They crouched behind a wooden beam, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The footsteps came closer, steady and sure. You go, he whispered. There's another exit on the north side. Take the horse and ride till you see water again. I'm not leaving you, she said. Wasn't asking, he replied. If they catch us both, nobody gets out. She gripped his arm. You think I can run while you die for me? I've already lost too much. The sound of boots on gravel grew louder. The cowboy raised his rifle, eyes fixed on the mouth of the tunnel. He could see shadows moving. 2 men, rifles drawn. The woman reached for her axe head, her breath ragged. "If we're doing this, we do it together." He gave her a faint smile. "You're as stubborn as I am. Maybe worse," she said. The first voice echoed through the darkness. "We know you're in there, Cowboy. Come out and maybe we'll make it quick." The cowboy steadied his aim. "You've got a funny way of offering mercy." The men laughed, their boots scraping closer. Snow fell heavy outside, muffling the world beyond the cave. The woman's heart hammered as she waited for the first spark of violence to break, and then, from the corner of the mine, came a new sound, low and deep, like a growl. The horse snorted nervously. Both the cowboy and the woman turned, realizing too late that the mine wasn't as empty as they thought. Something moved in the shadows behind them, a shape rising slow and heavy, the glint of eyes catching what little light remained. The cowboy's finger tightened on the trigger, but not toward the men anymore. Whatever lurked in that mine had been waiting a long time, and now, with danger closing in from both sides, there was nowhere left to run. The air inside the mine grew thick, every breath heavy with damp earth and fear. The woman froze, staring into the dark where the faint glint of eyes watched them. The cowboy's rifle shifted, but he didn't fire. The growl came again, deep and hollow, echoing through the stone. The men outside must have heard it too, because their laughter stopped. For a moment, the mine fell silent except for the sound of dripping water and the faint scrape of boots shifting on gravel. The cowboy whispered, "Stay still." The woman barely breathed. She could see his hand tightening on the rifle stock, knuckles white in the dim firelight. The growl moved closer, low and deliberate. Then the shape stepped forward, a gaunt black bear, ribs showing beneath its fur, one eye clouded over. The beast must have wandered into the mine during winter, trapped and starving, its head lowered, nostrils flaring at the scent of humans. The cowboy's eyes flicked toward the tunnel entrance where the two men's shadows lingered. He was trapped between predators, one hungry for blood, the other for vengeance. The woman's fingers brushed the broken axe head. She whispered, "What do we do?" He didn't answer. There wasn't time. The bear lunged suddenly, its roar shaking dust from the beams. The cowboy fired once, the sound deafening inside the narrow tunnel. The bullet struck the stone beside the creature, sending sparks across the dark. The men outside shouted, thinking he was firing at them. The bear reared back, confused by the echo, and the cowboy grabbed the woman's arm. "Run!" he barked. They bolted deeper into the mine, boots slipping on loose rocks. Behind them came the crash of claws on stone, the animal charging in blind fury. Bullets ripped through the entrance as the two men outside fired blindly into the dark. The shots bounced off walls, sending shards of stone flying. The cowboy turned and fired again, this time aiming true. The shot hit the bear's shoulder, but it only enraged it more. It roared, stumbling but still moving forward. The sound of its rage filled the tunnels. They ducked into a narrow side shaft, gasping for breath. The woman clutched her chest, eyes wide with terror. "It's coming," she whispered. He looked around, his mind racing. The passage split ahead, one side leading upward toward faint daylight, the other descending into blackness. The cowboy glanced back at the shadows. "We take the high path," she nodded, trusting him even as the roar came again, closer this time. The floor trembled under the weight of the beast. Dust rained down. The cowboy pushed her forward. "Go!" They scrambled up the slope, the cold air cutting through them as the sound of the bear's growls mixed with the shouts of men outside. Somewhere behind he could hear one of the riders calling out, voice mocking. "Ain't nowhere left to hide, cowboy." He ignored it and kept moving. The passage narrowed until they had to crawl. Rocks scraped their palms and every sound echoed like thunder. The woman's breath came fast, shallow. "I can't," she started, but he cut her off. "You can." The wind met them first, sharp and wild. Then the faint light appeared ahead. They burst out of the tunnel onto a ledge halfway up the mountainside. Snow whirled around them, and the valley below stretched endless and white. The woman staggered forward, clutching the stone wall for balance. The cowboy came out behind her, scanning the terrain. There was no cover, just open air, rocks, and a drop that would kill them both if they slipped. "We have to move," he said, pulling her away from the edge. "They'll find this exit." Before she could answer, a rifle cracked from below. The bullet struck the rock beside them, sending chips flying. She ducked, and the cowboy pulled her behind a boulder. The scarred man's voice echoed from the valley. "There you are. Thought you could crawl into the earth and vanish." The cowboy leaned out, fired once, and ducked back. The bullet whined past the rocks below. The two men spread apart, moving to flank them. "They're cutting us off," she said, panic in her voice. He nodded grimly. "Then we climb." The wind howled, pushing against them as they scaled the ridge. The rocks were slick with ice, and the woman's boots slipped more than once. The cowboy reached back, steadying her each time. His hands were bleeding from the climb, but he didn't let go. When they reached a narrow shelf near the top, they stopped to catch their breath. From here, they could see the vast expanse of wilderness. Trees frozen in white, the river like a silver vein winding through the land. It was beautiful, but it offered no mercy. She turned to him, her face pale but determined. "You could have left me in that barn," she said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a moment before answering, "Because no one deserves to die alone." Something flickered in her eyes, something almost like hope. But before either could speak again, the echo of boots scraped behind them. The men were climbing fast. "Go!" he shouted, pulling her toward a narrow crevice in the rock. They slipped inside just as bullets cracked against the stone. The woman fell to her knees, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "They won't stop," she said, voice shaking. "They'll hunt us till we're gone." The cowboy leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "Then we make our stand." Down below, the voices grew louder. The scarred man called out again. "You can't hide forever, cowboy. I just want the woman. You give her up and I'll let you walk." The woman's head snapped up. "He's lying," the cowboy smirked faintly. "I know." The wind carried the smell of gunpowder up the ridge. He knew they had maybe minutes before the men reached them. He reloaded his rifle, fingers steady despite the cold. "You still got that axe head?" he asked. She nodded, gripping it tight. "I do." "Then when I say move, you head for the far side. There's a slope that leads down to the river. Stay low, stay quiet. And you?" He gave a small, tired smile. "I'll keep them busy." She shook her head. "No, I'm not leaving you." Before he could argue, the first of the pursuers appeared on the ridge below, rifle in hand. The cowboy fired, striking the rock beside him and forcing him back. The shot echoed down the mountainside. The woman covered her ears, heart hammering. "Now!" he shouted. She hesitated only a second before running toward the far edge. The snow made her steps slippery, and the slope was steeper than it looked. She half slid, half ran, clutching the axe head like it could save her life. Behind her, she heard more gunfire, the sharp crack of bullets hitting stone, and the cowboy's voice shouting orders she couldn't make out. At the bottom of the slope, she stumbled to her knees. The river glinted below, thin and fast between banks of ice. She looked back up, saw the flash of a coat, the silhouette of the cowboy firing again and again, holding his ground like a man with nothing left to lose. Then came another sound, an explosion of splintering wood and roaring fury. The bear. It had followed the noise, drawn out of the mine by the scent of blood and smoke. It burst from the cave entrance, fur matted, one shoulder bleeding. The men shouted, turning their guns toward it. The cowboy took the chance. He grabbed the woman's hand as she reached the ridge again. "This way!" he yelled, pulling her toward the narrow path leading west. The bear roared behind them, the men firing wildly as it charged. Snow and stone tumbled down the slope in a storm of chaos. The two fugitives ran, slipping and stumbling, their lungs burning. The roar of the river grew louder. The cowboy looked back once, seeing the beast crash into one of the riders, sending both tumbling down the cliff. The other fired again, but his shot went wide. They reached the edge of the ridge where the ground dropped into the river valley. The current below was fierce, breaking against rocks. The woman turned to him, shaking her head. "We can't cross that." His eyes were steady, though his breath came ragged. "We might not get another chance." The wind whipped between them, carrying the sound of the surviving man shouting from above. The cowboy grabbed her shoulders, voice firm but gentle. "You trust me?" "I don't even know your name," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Then maybe you'll learn it if we live through this." Gunfire cracked again, the sound echoing through the valley. The woman flinched as a bullet struck the rock near her feet. The cowboy looked down at the rushing river below, then back at her. The decision was written on his face. Above them, the wounded bear let out one final, echoing roar, a sound that drowned out even the gunfire. And in that single frozen moment, as snow swirled and the mountain seemed to hold its breath, the cowboy took her hand and stepped toward the edge. The river waited below, roaring like fate itself. The river swallowed them whole. The cold struck first, so fierce it tore the breath from their lungs and burned through their clothes. The current dragged them apart, spinning them through waves and foam. The cowboy fought against it, reaching out until his hand found hers again. Their fingers locked, and he pulled her toward a calmer stretch downstream. They hit the rocks hard, gasping, water filling their mouths as they fought to stay above the surface. Then, with one last push, they reached the muddy bank, collapsing in the snow. For a long moment, neither moved. The sky above them was gray and trembling, snow falling like ash. The woman coughed and rolled onto her side, her face pale but alive. The cowboy lay beside her, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the sky. His hat was gone, his coat torn open, but his rifle still hung across his back. Somehow it hadn't been lost to the current. "You still breathing?" he asked weakly. She gave a faint laugh between gasps. "Barely." He smiled just for a moment, then forced himself up. His arms shook with exhaustion, but he helped her to her feet. Behind them, the river carried chunks of ice and driftwood, sweeping away any trace of where they'd fallen. Above, the cliffs loomed sharp and dark. There was no sign of the men or the bear. The sound of the wind had taken everything. "We made it," she whispered. "For now," he said. "They'll look for us when the storm clears." They stumbled along the riverbank until they found a grove of pine trees. The cowboy built a small fire under the shelter of a leaning trunk. It took time. His fingers were numb, his matches damp, but at last, the flame caught. The woman sat close, her hands trembling over the warmth. Her clothes were soaked, and her face was streaked with mud. Yet there was something alive in her eyes again, something that had been gone for a long time. The cowboy tore a strip from his coat and wrapped it around her wrist, which had bled during the fall. "You'll be all right," he said softly. "You saved me," she whispered. He shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a nudge." They shared what little food was left, a few crumbs of jerky, a sip of cold coffee. The wind howled outside the pines, but inside their small circle of light it felt almost safe. The woman watched the flames dance, her voice barely more than a breath. "Do you think the others made it?" The cowboy's eyes darkened. "No, men like that don't belong to the land. It takes them sooner or later." They sat in silence listening to the wind. The woman finally asked the question that had lingered since the start. "Why did you stop for me that night at the barn?" He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because I saw what I used to be. Hungry, angry, thinking pride could keep me alive. You reminded me that there's still a line between surviving and giving up." She looked at him quietly, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "And which one are you now?" He smiled faintly. "Still trying to decide." The night passed slowly. When dawn came, the storm had cleared and sunlight broke across the valley. The river steamed where the water met cold air. The land looked almost gentle again, though both knew how easily it could turn cruel. They packed their few things and began walking west. As they climbed a hill, the woman pointed toward the horizon. "That ridge there," she said, holding out the letter her sister had written. "If we cross it, we should see Black Hollow." He nodded, though his legs ached and his ribs throbbed from the fall. The thought of another day's walk might have broken him once, but now it only gave him purpose. Every step westward meant a chance, a small one but enough. They walked through the morning, stopping only when they reached a patch of open meadow. The woman smiled faintly as she looked around. "It's strange," she said. "After all the fear, the running, the noise. It's quiet now." The cowboy scanned the horizon. Too quiet, maybe, but there was no danger this time. Only the sound of the wind through grass, the rush of the river below, and the distant call of a hawk. For the first time since they'd met, peace felt possible. By evening, they reached a cluster of old cabins. Most were broken down, roofs caved in, but smoke drifted from one chimney. The woman's eyes widened. "That has to be it," she said. "My sister's place." She started forward, stumbling through the snow, her voice calling out into the air. The door of the cabin opened, and a small figure stepped out, a young girl no older than 10. Behind her came a woman with the same brown hair, the same eyes. The two sisters stared at each other across the clearing, disbelief turning slowly into tears. The woman dropped her blanket and ran. They met halfway, falling into each other's arms. The cowboy stood back, watching the reunion with quiet relief. The girl ran up to him, peeking from behind her aunt's skirt. "Are you the cowboy who saved her?" she asked shyly. He smiled tiredly. "Guess you could say that." The sister invited him inside, and warmth hit him like a wave. The cabin was small but full of life, bread baking on the stove, a quilt half finished on a chair. For the first time in months, the woman looked like she belonged somewhere again. That night, as they sat around the fire, she turned to him. "You could stay here," she said softly. "You've got no reason to keep riding." He looked into the flames, thinking. Maybe not. But men like me, we're better at leaving than staying. She reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve. "You've already done enough leaving. Maybe it's time to rest." He didn't answer right away. The wind outside brushed against the windows like a whisper from the world they'd escaped. He thought of the barns burned behind them, the tracks buried in snow, and the faces of men who'd never learn what mercy meant. Then he looked at her, the woman who had faced hunger and terror and still stood unbroken. "I reckon I could stay a while," he said finally. Her smile was small but full of light. "Then stay until spring," he nodded. "Spring sounds about right." In the weeks that followed, the land softened under the sun. Snow melted from the hills, and new grass pushed through the soil. The cowboy helped mend fences, chop wood, and fix the roof of the cabin. The woman's laughter returned, faint at first but growing stronger each day. Her sister's family treated him like kin, and the little girl followed him everywhere, asking questions about horses and gun belts. Sometimes, when the day ended and the stars began to shine, the cowboy sat by the river and watched the water flow. It carried with it the memory of everything he and the woman had survived. The hunger, the chase, the storm. He knew there were still places in the world where men like the ones they'd escaped would go on hunting, and others like him would keep wandering. But here for now there was peace. One evening the woman joined him by the river. She sat beside him, quiet, watching the light fade. "I never thanked you," she said. He glanced at her. "You don't have to." "I want to," she insisted. "For giving me back more than my life. For giving me reason to believe people can still be kind." He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Kindness don't cost much. Folks just forget it exists." They sat together in silence until the stars filled the sky. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and the wind carried the sound across the open land. The woman leaned her head against his shoulder and he didn't move away. In that moment, everything felt still. The endless land that once held only sorrow now felt alive again. They had both come to the edge of despair and found something worth living for. Something simple and human. The cowboy closed his eyes, breathing in the smell of pine and river water. "You were right," he murmured. "It's quiet now," the woman smiled softly. "Quiet can be good," he nodded. "Yeah. Sometimes it means you finally made it." And as the night deepened over the frontier, the fire from the cabin flickered warm against the dark. The land was vast and wild, but for two souls who had spent too long running, it finally felt like home.